If you had to choose the most important chapter in Paul's letters, which one would you pick? Well, a lot of people might say Romans 1 or Romans 8, maybe something from Galatians. Now, of course, it's really hard to choose just one chapter. But for me and many others, Romans 11 would be at the top of the list. Because in Romans 11, Paul addresses a question that has loomed large for Bible readers for 2,000 years. And that's this. What about Israel? Has God rejected his people? Well, Paul answers this question with clarity and conviction right out of the gate in Romans 11. So in verses 1 and 2, Paul declares, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So twice in 2 verses, Paul says it plainly. God has not rejected Israel. And to be clear, Paul makes this statement in reference to his Jewish kinsmen who are not persuaded that Jesus is the Messiah. Oddly enough, though, and with tremendous implications, many of Paul's interpreters have read Romans 11 and concluded the very opposite. From early church fathers to Martin Luther and up to the present day, many Bible readers have assumed that Jews who don't believe in Jesus are rejected by God and can only be readmitted into God's family by believing in Jesus. So that viewpoint is heavily informed by Romans 11 verses 25 and 26, which many understand to be a clear statement by Paul that Jews who don't believe in Jesus are hard-hearted and need to be saved in the traditional Christian sense of the term. But is that what Paul really meant when he famously wrote, all Israel will be saved? And if so, how does that harmonize with what Paul already said about Israel not being rejected? Well, let's see if we can clear up some confusion by first looking at how Romans 11 verses 25 and 26 is typically translated and interpreted. So here's how the English Standard Version, the ESV, translates it. It says, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. All right, so at first glance, this sounds simple. Israel has been hardened, and at some point, Israel will be saved. And that's how many have read these verses. But again, this raises an important question. If Paul has already told us that Israel has not been rejected, then why would they need to be saved in the sense of being readmitted to God's family? Well, when we take a closer look at Paul's words in Greek, and in light of his overall argument in Romans 11, a different reading can emerge that demonstrates Paul's consistency and his conviction that God's commitment to Israel is unshakable. Now, before we dig into these critical verses, I do want to give credit to the work of Mark Nanos, Brian Tucker, and William S. Campbell for their excellent insights, which have really informed my perspective on this text, which we'll now jump into. And let's start with the phrase in Romans 11:25, which says, a partial hardening has come upon Israel. Now, for many readers, this immediately evokes the story of Pharaoh and the hardening of his heart. And it sounds like Paul is saying that Israel's heart is just as stubborn and resistant as Pharaoh's. But Paul doesn't use the same word here in Romans 11:25 that he did use for Pharaoh in Romans 9. So over in Romans 9, Paul used the Greek word skleruno, which is a word that does describe the hardening of the heart. But in Romans 11:25, Paul uses an entirely different word. It's the Greek word porosis. And porosis doesn't mean hard heart. Rather, it means a callus in the sense of a protective covering. Notice, too, that Paul never says anything about Israel's heart in Romans 11:25. Actually, he's still using the plant and tree language that he's already been using in this chapter. So instead of picturing Israel as obstinate or defiant, Paul may be saying that a protective callus has formed. So for Paul, Israel's stumble over the gospel is real, and their injury is real. but it's temporary, like a callus. It's not a permanent rejection by God or a permanent hardening of their hearts. Instead, Paul is painting a picture that this is all part of God's mysterious plan. And think about why that matters. If Paul is communicating that Israel's heart is hard, I don't think that really helps his cause in seeking to halt the arrogance that's emerging among the Gentile Christians in Rome towards the Jewish people. But if Paul is telling these Gentile Christians that Israel's being protected in their stumble, well, then that's the kind of language that would encourage the kind of humility and mercy that Paul was hoping would emerge from these Christians towards Israel. Well, let's move on to the famous line in verse 26 where Paul writes, "And in this way all Israel will be saved." Now, the Greek word here for saved is sozo. And when most Christians hear saved, they immediately think of personal conversion, someone outside of God's family being brought in through Christ. And that's how 2,000 years of Christian theology have trained many to hear the word saved. But sozo had a much broader range of meaning in Paul's world. In fact, the ancient philosopher Theophrastus, the so-called father of botany, he used the term sozo to describe the preservation and restoration of plants and trees. In other words, sozo was often used to mean kept safe or protected or preserved. So maybe Paul isn't talking about Israel needing to be saved in the way later Christian theology would define salvation. Instead, he may be talking about Israel being preserved and kept safe through the strange and unexpected season of history when, from his perspective, Israel had stumbled in its role to herald the gospel to the Gentiles. And this reading actually aligns more closely with the rest of Paul's argument. Remember, he has already said Israel has not fallen, has not been rejected. And in verse 16 of Romans 11, he even says that they are holy. And in just a few verses, he'll say that they are beloved and that God's gifts and calling to Israel are irrevocable. So when Paul says all Israel will be sozo, we might just as faithfully render this as all Israel will be made safe, as Mark Nanos has translated this text in his work on Romans. Now, why does all this matter? Well, it matters because for centuries, translations and interpretations of Romans 11 have created a confusing picture that presents Israel on the one hand as not rejected, and on the other hand, Israel is understood to be cut off and in need of being saved in the sense of being readmitted to the people of God. And the reality is most interpreters have given greater emphasis to the text that seem to paint Israel as being cut off. But there's a much more coherent way to understand Paul's argument in Romans 11. Israel hasn't been cut off, and they haven't fallen. In Romans, Paul is in anguish that his Jewish kinsmen haven't embraced Jesus. But he nonetheless insists that Israel remains safe as God's covenant people. And he insists that God will restore Israel, though how that takes place remains a mystery and is not for his readers to decide or know. And maybe that's the heart of Romans 11, that Israel remains safe in God's promises and that the nations are invited to join them, not replace them, as God extends his mercy to all. Hey, if you'd like to learn more about Paul and his Jewish and Greco-Roman context, check out my book, The Weird Apostle. You can find it on Amazon, and don't miss out on any of my new content by subscribing wherever you're watching or listening. And if you'd like to learn more about how to build bridges between Jews and Christians, check out bridgebuildersforum.com.